Hi and welcome to this week's GMBN Tech Show. Coming up on the show this week we have more no-clog valves, we have a hybrid transmission, this thing is absolutely wild. We've got more mullet bikes as well, and we've got a really cool couple of rewind entries too. Okay, so let's kick the show off this week by talking about alternative transmissions. Now last week, myself and Josh, cameraman, were over at Bike Park Wells filming with a Gearbox bike using an FE Gear gearbox. And since then, my feed has been full of weird and intricately designed bikes with all sorts of bizarre stuff going on, including this. The Lao Bikes Super Drive. Get your eyes on this. So this thing is wild looking. Look at the rear wheel, and you can see it's still got a cassette on there. And it still appears to have some kind of rear derailleur. Now look up close, there's a bunch of shots from their website and also from their Instagram page. Please give them a follow. This is really cool, this project. I guess what you could say is they've created a hybrid transmission setup. It's kind of got some elements of a gearbox system and some elements of a regular external transmission, kind of combining to offer what neither of them can offer at once. So a bunch more shots on screen. So in theory, what they say is it's more efficient than a gearbox. As we know with gearbox bikes, you have cogs constantly in contact with each other, turning around inside fluid. So although that is the thing that makes them excellent, it also creates a little bit of drag. Although nominal, some people won't like that. Now, it's lighter than the gearbox, which is great because gearboxes are fairly substantial in weight, even though the weight sits on a sprung mass, which is a good thing. They're slightly heavier than an external transmission, but your unsprung mass is lighter because you're moving some of those components inboard. Now, essentially the way it works, if you ignore the frame for a minute, you try and look at the contraption itself. So you've got the cassette in place and you've got a mech that's mounted on 2 points rather than a single point in a precarious position. The mech is partially protected by the frame. The mech is actually split into 2 parts. The part that's nearer to a conventional rear derailleur takes care of shifting the gears. The other part, sitting above the main drivetrain sprocket or the chainring, takes care of tensioning the gears. And it actually tensions the gears equally throughout the entire sort of cycle of changing gears. Now, in order to actually use this, the designer had to actually design a frame, and in order to do that he had to learn to weld and then design a frame. So he's essentially done the entire process to bring this to sort of fruition. Obviously it's utilising a high pivot concept here as well, so we already know, we've talked about high pivot bikes with a kickback and stuff. The chain running around the top is part of the system. So in theory, with the way this works, it should have a lot of the benefits of a high pivot system, but also less drag. So look at the idler wheel on there that's part of that drivetrain. It's massive. So the bigger the wheel is, in theory, the less friction you have running through it. So in case you're not familiar, an idler wheel system on a high pivot bike, you would have your rear suspension design with a high main pivot, and they'll put a little sprocket known as the idler wheel and the chain running over the top of the pivot. That essentially helps it be less susceptible to pedal kickback and pedal a bit more like a low pivot bike, but have a really good suspension action. But of course, adding the extra wheel on creates a bit more friction. So by smoothing that sort of the journey the chain has to make around that, it's going to make things run a lot smoother. But it's not alone, and clearly in looking at this on Instagram quite a lot over the weekend, my algorithm's changed and it keeps serving me up other bikes with weird gearboxes, and seeing loads of old Nicolizer stuff pop up. But look at this. So this bike I'm looking at here is from Williams Racing Products, and it's essentially what you can work out just looking at it here. There's a couple of little video clips, one from each side of the bike. It's a mid-mounted SRAM access drivetrain, essentially in there. So in case you're not familiar, Honda made the RN01 downhill bike years back, and it had a gearbox on it with a high pivot, with the sort of constant transmission running above the crankset there. So essentially like using an idler wheel, but a direct drive. Now this bike looked amazing, and for years everyone was like, well, what is inside the gearbox? Everyone wanted to know. But essentially it was a derailleur and a cassette inside a box, but mounted mid-frame. So you're having a low friction system, but mounted on the bike. So you haven't got this sort of, you're not worrying about the sprung mass versus unsprung mass. You're not worrying about a derailleur hanging off the back of the bike. So really cool concept. And this kind of reminds me of that in a bit more of a clumsy way. I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just like, this is work in progress. It's a pretty crazy concept. But imagine if this had a housing around that gearbox. It could be very, very cool. Are there any more out there? Has anyone seen any more bizarre gearing systems on bikes? Because I want to see them. Put them in the links underneath there. Okay, into news now, and a bit of mullet speak for you. Nukeproof have made their mullet style rear end available. So essentially it's just a 275 rear end that you can mount onto your 290 front end. That is if you have one of the version 4 mega frames, or if you've got a Giga and it's a 290 version, it means you can now buy one of these rear ends for 699 quid. It comes in black only at the moment, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. One size fits all and all that. You'll need to buy a new rear wheel as well, 27.5, but the mullet style mixed wheel setup is an available option. I wonder if we're going to see that from Canyon as well. Next up, Intend Night Rider fork. Look at this. Oh my God. So I'm a bit of a fan of Intend forks. I've never ridden them. I've felt them in a car park before, felt them at Eurobike, and they feel unbelievably smooth. And to be honest, I've only heard good things about them. The performance is said to be really, really good. But they should do, because they cost quite a lot of money. This set costs €1,595. Certainly not cheap. But a cool little story here is they've got black anodized stanchion tubes on them. So that's the lower leg on these forks, which are inverted. And essentially, because of supply chain problems, they've ended up having these made locally to where they're based. So that's just a great thing, using more local resources, not moving stuff around. Always a good thing. So they've got up to 180 millimeters of travel, adjustable in 10 millimeter increments, available for 27.5 and 29 inch. They weigh 2,090 grams in the 27.5 and 2,130 grams in the 29. And I just think they're a thing of beauty. I have something about inverted forks that I've always loved. And well, we've said this before, we say inverted, but technically it's the correct way up if you were to look at how motorcycle suspension operates. So if you think about this, there's a bunch of good things with an inverted fork design like this, because you've got a bigger part of the fork at the top. So your sprung to unsprung mass ratio, you've got more weight on the bike and you've got less weight of the wheel that's going up and down. So that's a good thing. The seals, basically naturally in an open bath design like this one, the oil is going to sit naturally against them, so they're always lubricated, ready for use. And of course, the bigger part of the fork at the top means they're going to be much stiffer under braking, so when you're really loading the bike up. So loads of positives about them, but to make them stiff enough torsionally, it's been quite a mission for a lot of brands to do it, but it sounds like Intend have nailed this. So maybe one day I'll get to try them out somewhere, we'll see. But they certainly look really, really good. And they also do a bunch of other amazing stuff, so check their website out, there's going to be a link to it underneath. Have a look on there, some very cool stuff on there. More mullet bikes. In fact, the whole mullet mixed wheel thing is going mad, isn't it? Does anyone actually like the look of them? I think they look kind of quite hideous, to be honest, but I get the theory behind them. I think they obviously do a job. Got an e-bike sat over there. It's got the mixed wheel set up on that, and actually it works brilliant on there. I think probably because of the fact the e-bike is such a heavy bike to ride that a smaller wheel on the back aids a bit of sort of agility to the feel. I think it works great on there. I'm just not a fan of how they look. But Kotick are available now in mullet configurations, but they're taking a slightly different approach. So they're not using a flip chip, they're not using different length chainstays or anything like that. They're essentially putting an angled headset to steepen the head tube angle up to return the geometry. And they're doing this with a British-made headset known as Works Components. So if you're in the market, by the way, for an angle adjusting headset, check out Works Components. They're going to be down there somewhere as well. I've got one on my old Intense, I think a 1.5 degree, like a minus on those, but they're essentially flipping those around to steepen up, which is quite cool. So it sounds like you can do this on the Rocket Max, the Jet and the Flare Max, and it's quite cool. I like the fact that people are offering this. So this is always a good thing if you want the choice of doing it. You don't have to do it, of course. You know, you could just run pure 27.5 or pure 29, whatever suits you. There's now options from more brands. That can't be a bad thing. Also, just had these turn up. We referenced those reserve valves last week on the show, and I also mentioned the 76 Projects ones, which I saw the prototypes of at the Malverns, and it seems that they have them in production now. So they're essentially large bore valves. You can take the bottom straight off them for easy cleaning should you need to, but it sounds like you won't need to. You can inject sealant directly through the valve. You can use them with a push-on style pump currently only. I think they do adapters for them, but they're no clog valves, and what do they call it? 4 times the airflow of regular Presta valves. So if you're struggling with setting up tubeless, or you're struggling with valves getting clogged up, maybe that is a good solution for you. But nice to see them in the flesh. They look great. Good things. And also, this just made me laugh. I referenced these from Bentley Components recently, the other day. Well, they sent one through. A bit of a cheeky top cap there, but also a couple of really nice things. So they do these top caps, which will be great for the weight weenies out there. So if you're like a cross-country rider or racer, perhaps you've got a carbon fork, something like that, this is a top cap and a bolt sort of all in one. It takes into account that it needs to be for, I think, for a 4.5mm top cap, goes over the top and even comes with a tool to tighten it, to adjust your preload. It just looks nice and neat. You don't have a bolt on the top. I really like that. That's quite a nice approach. Okay, quiz time. 3 questions coming at you. First one, on screen. Why are inverted forks said to ride so well? Second question, guess what bike this is. Photo on screen. Might be a couple of photos. And the third one, what is the biggest reason for not fitting a coil shock to your trail suspension bike? A few clues in the video that went out the weekend. Okay, now it's time for comments, and flipping it, there's a lot of comments from last week's show about sustainability and that. It seems like we've opened a huge can of worms there. Physically haven't had the time to go through all of these. There's loads of stuff in there, but there's also a load of other stuff. It seems everyone on earth loves that new Bold bike. It is a beautiful looking bike, but more than a few people have also commented on there about the lack of piggyback compatibility. But it still makes me wonder what's next. There probably will be a longer travel one coming. But yeah, I would like the option personally, if I was going to own a bike like that, of having a piggyback. But well, probably not going to get one of those bikes, so it doesn't really matter. So some comments, right, so first one from Will Lange. Really interesting discussion on sustainability. Greenwashing is a real problem, particularly in outdoor sports. If you built new bikes and there's typically a huge pile of plastic and foam trash left in the bin when you're done, props to Trek for taking real steps forward. I'd like to see environmental impact scores on bikes. It would help me choose which one to buy. Hey, that's a great idea. And the brands that I mentioned and the things I mentioned, don't assume they're the only ones, and don't assume that they're the people doing it best. There were just a few that I just saw that stood out to me. There's a lot of people that are doing it, and also, like you say, greenwashing, it does sound like it is a bit of a problem. So it's a vast topic to look into, something I do think we're going to have to revisit, but it's too much for covering a show. I think it's a separate video. Next up's from Dreads and Dirt MTB. It so happens that the same toe peak digital gauge fits on my Zeb air valve. All right, so I was talking about the little tyre gauge pump there. The gauge on my pump, as it turns out, was measuring about 6 psi low. Sorted that out, and both bikes feel as amazing as they should have done from the start. Do you know what? I can't believe I've never tried that same tool on my shock or my fork. Crazy. I might try that as well. Good tips. David Dunlop. Great points, Doddy. However, the biggest impact by far on the environment the industry can do about is extending the life of bikes. Yeah, here. Commit to lessen the model refresh rate and allow existing bikes to be upgradable using parts rather than not compatible with previous models, especially with EMTBs. Yeah, I mean, looking at that in reverse, EMTBs, I think you're probably seeing things like this happen because it's such a new thing. They're striving to find out what's actually the best thing to do, not to suggest that that's the correct thing, but I reckon that's what's going on there. But yeah, I do think the model refresh rate thing, I think we're going to slowly see that it's starting to change, probably because of the fact that the supply chain issues we've had over the last few years is forcing manufacturers' hand to not produce a sort of an annual bike, but to produce a bike that comes with, let's say it comes with a Shimano SLX on it, and you're buying it right now in November 2021, and it might come with this year's SLX, but if you buy it in December, it might come with next year's SLX, but it's still the same sort of year model bike as such. I think there will be a bit of a change of the guard to that sort of stuff moving forwards, but yeah, I do agree, and it does feel a bit unfair as well if it sort of affects you as a consumer. If you buy a bike and then it feels like your bike's suddenly outdated, you know, the next year, and you need to replace it, it's just like, well, you don't, do you? As we've proven on some videos, you can fix up bikes, you can keep bikes going by looking after them. So yeah, these are all really good points. Christopher Yarborough, those new valves, in fact, the other version, the reserve versions of these I was talking about, are a no for me. I like to inject sealant through the valve stem when I set tyres up. That's exactly what I do, to be fair, and check them the same way periodically. Since the valves are removable, it's also really easy to clean them so they don't clog. Do you know what? As much as they are a really good idea, and I do think they're a great idea for many people, and I would still like to really try them myself, I also do exactly the same with putting sealant in through the valve. I've always done that, and I use one of these injector things as well to do that. So Yeah, I see the problem there, you know, from both ends of the spectrum, but clogged valves are a pain in the arse if that does happen to you. More the point, rather than the clogged valves, is when you bend the end of them and they sort of snap and they come off and your air all comes out. It's just annoying, that. Jasper Betch says, hand cleaner, instead of sugar, you can also use coffee grains. I thought that was a great idea, and a couple of people said that, but Peter DeWitt commented on that and said, sugar dissolves when it goes down the drain. Coffee can clog plumbing. Enough rubbish in our sewers already causing fatbergs and overspills straight into our rivers and seas. Yeah, that's also a really good point. Yeah, the coffee grains, I actually had heard a few people talking about that, and it does make sense. But yeah, some things definitely shouldn't go down the drain, that is for sure. But all valid points from everyone. Okay, now it's time for Rewind. Always love a bit of old school action on the show. If you've got anything old school, there's a link right there. There's another one down there. Get involved and send it in, because there's plenty of cool stuff to look back at and we'll laugh at, really, to see where you've come from. But we wouldn't be riding such good bikes if it wasn't for the old stuff, so let's always celebrate that. Okay, so this old school elevated chainstay bike is from Dennis in the Netherlands, and he watched our GMBN Most Influential Bikes video, and we're talking about all sorts of different brands on there. Do you know what though? I don't think I've seen one of these before. Really not sure. But you say you got it as a regular about town bike with awful tyres and heavy wheels, and you've upgraded the wheels and components, and it rides surprisingly well. I can't tell you more about the brand, but I do think it's really nice. So the frame design itself is an old elevated chainstay. So when mountain biking first kind of started progressing and everyone was trying to sort of identify what's good about bikes, a short chainstay length was something that everyone looked for to have snappy handling, so you get the front wheel up but also quick acceleration. The downside was you used to have a front derailleur with 3 chainrings at the front, and trying to squeeze the chainstay in and fit all of that in at the front end meant there was always problems with shifting or chain line, or a phenomenon known as chain suck. So your chainring basically would wrap around, the chain would wrap around the chainring sometimes, just going over bumps. It gets stuck in between the chainstay basically and the chainring, and it literally get wedged in there, taking out paint and sometimes breaking the chain. So some manufacturers, like Veloz here, would actually move the chainstay up and out harm's way, so you could really bring in the back end, have a really tight back end without affecting shifting. The downside though was not all frame manufacturers nailed it, because you've essentially got your bottom bracket just hanging down there on a tube, and they weren't always stiff enough. So sometimes they're pedalled and you can literally see the frame moving around, other times not. But that looks seriously cool. I'd love a bike, something like that, put some full mud guards and a rack on it and use it as a commuter bike, an old bike. I think there's probably a cool video there in getting hold of an old bike and sort of doing it up as your daily runner, because that thing looks awesome. So you've got Onza Canis tyres on there. They look great, and you've basically brought it back to life. I think it's really cool. And the bottle looks like it's kind of old school, the big classic Specialized S on there as well. I really like it. I think it's a cool looking bike, but sorry dude, I cannot tell you that much about that. You say that you think I mentioned that name or something similar. I'm not sure I did, or if I did, I don't remember doing it. I'll have to go back and watch that video. Next one though this is another great old bike. So this is from Stuart in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. It's a 1995 Kona Explosive. Awesome looking bike. So Kona bikes, man, like I've always loved them. They always had that aggressive sloping top tube from the very beginning, way before many other brands sort of adopted it. There's only a handful that really did that in the early days. Before that, they're almost sloping the opposite way like road bikes. So this really gave mountain bikes a unique identity. Also, keeping the standover height more realistic for off-road riding. In one of your early episodes, you showed a disc brake adapter I made for my 95 Explosive. Didn't want to have the tabs welded to the frames. It felt like time had come. I'd want to restore the bike, and now it's happened. So he's completely restored the bike. Awesome looking stuff. It's now running an almost complete XTR M900 group set. Beautiful looking. Just missing the canties and the front derailleur, and an original Marzocchi Z1 fork that I've resprayed in black. I didn't have one of the original canty hangers for the fork, but managed to get my hands on one of the old Marzocchi rockers. Homemade a custom plate to adapt this to the bomber arch. Bit of a pain, but it works. I'll tell you what, I've done a great job on it. It looks really good. What is the stem? That looks really familiar. Love the sort of the pinch bolt design on that. Very cool. Sort of all internal on there. Answer Hyperlite bars. I don't know what bar ends they are. They could be X-Lite. Can't quite see from here. Man, those XTR, the shifter pods, the rapid fire pods look beautiful. The shaping of them. It's still as good looking as I remember it, that group set. A-core cantilevers. very similar looking to the Marin ones and many other brands actually that existed at the time. Yeah, they look pretty good. They kind of suit on there. Yeah, there's that little rocker. Kind of quirky. Man, look how narrow the bars are. I mean, they're pretty wide for the era, but tiny by today's standards. They look like Ritchie grips on those as well, the sort of shape of those. XCR hub, man, it just looks class, doesn't it? Cranks are a bit beaten up, but that's good. They've had a long paper round. Oh, looks nice. Oh, you've done a great job on that. Oh, look at rear hub, all polished and nice. Looking great. Oh man, I love seeing this old stuff. But no illusions, it's nothing compared to what we have today. But if you've got anything cool and old and nostalgic, including old family pictures of them riding mountain bikes before you did, let us know. Link is right there. Okay, now time for some quiz answers. How did you get on with those? So the first one was, why are inverted forks said to ride so well? There's actually a few reasons here. So the bigger part of the fork at the top is a good thing because it's stiffer under braking. It's just bigger and stronger at the front where you're really loading up the bike. Less unsprung mass. So your sprung mass is the main frame of the bike. Your unsprung mass are the wheels. So the lighter effectively your wheels can be, the better your suspension is going to work. And of course, by flipping the fork the other way up, you've got the heavy bit at the top, which is part of the frame. And the part that's moving up and down into that frame is lighter. So the action of those forks, at least on paper, the theory says that they should work a lot better. And they always have felt really good, but some of the issues with them have been a little bit of flex. But a few brands, like I referred earlier on the show, those in 10 forks, are supposed to be fantastic. I had some Marzocchi Shivers and some Shiver SCs back in the day. Loved them, but they were super bendy to ride, but I kind of still loved them because they worked so nicely. And the last one was the seals were always lubricated because of the fact the forks are inverted. The Marzocchis I had were open oil bath design, so oil is literally free flowing inside the fork, which means they lubricate themselves as you use them. And what better way to lubricate the seals and turning it upside down. It's also a reason why sometimes I like to hang a bike up by the side, because then any sort of lower leg lubricant in there can find its way. Of course, you've got capillary action that's going to work while the fork's working, but it can help it drain up towards the seals there to help them feel really good. Next one. Did you guess what the bike was? Yeah, it's a Starling Spur. So you might have seen some hints on the social media front there. You also might have seen some hints from the fact I was riding at Bike Park Wales. I mentioned I was riding a Gearbox bike at Bike Park Wales. And we made a video with Starling Cycles recently where we discussed gearboxes and are they the future of bikes? Well, stay tuned to the channel coming up at the weekend, because we've got a video looking at Drivetrains, essentially like a non-scientific test, riding a gearbox transmission with a external transmission and just observing what the differences are in a real world situation. It's good fun actually, really enjoyed it. And the last one was, what is the biggest reason for not fitting a coil shock to your bike? Anyone get this? Well, unlike air shocks that are progressive by nature, the coil shock is linear by nature. So this is both a good thing. It doesn't mean it's a bad shock. It just means it won't necessarily fit with certain frame designs. So if your bike has a linear leverage curve on the back end and you put a linear shock on it, you're going to be blowing through that travel a lot more than you would if you were to use an air shock on there, which is progressive by nature. It gets firmer towards the end of the travel. Which is ideally what you would look for. Not essential, but it is preferable. And that's really the main reason. How did you get on with that? Did you get the answers all right? Good stuff. Okay, so that's the end of this week's show. We'll see you on next week's show. Thanks for watching. Ta-ra.